Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on the Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers, officially titled A North American Jewish Response, organized by the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, fondly referred to as the JCPA. My name is Dan Rapp. I'm a JCPA Frank Fellow, and as a part of my fellowship this year, I participated in the JCPA leadership mission to Israel. And during this mission, we met firsthand with asylum seekers in South Tel Aviv. We also met with Israelis who are providing services to them. We met with policy level people and government officials. It's just like a little bit of background. Right now, there are about 40,000 Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers living in Israel, most of whom fled Eritrea and Sudan between 2007 and 2012. So to respond to this influx of people, Israel secured its national borders in around 2011. Essentially, they built a wall along the southern border. And while this stopped one problem of people entering Israel without any kind of documentation, it didn't answer the problem of what to do with the asylum seekers who are already there in Israel. We all know that Israel has a policy for Jewish immigration, but it does not have one for non-Jewish immigration. So when we got home from Israel from this trip, the government of Israel started to announce that it had negotiated agreements with several African governments, including Uganda and Rwanda, to accept these asylum seekers, and there are currently plans underway to deport folks to these countries. The JCPA issued a statement to the Prime Minister of Israel requesting that it suspend its plan to deport these people and develop a comprehensive policy for non-Jewish asylum seekers that safeguards human dignity and safeguards human rights. And this would be in compliance with Israel's obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention. We believe that such a policy would ensure Israel's security and honor Israel's values as a compassionate, Jewish, and democratic state. Since then, many in our field have expressed concern about Israel's policy and have also worked to educate and translate what's happening in Israel to our non-Jewish partners who are learning about this issue only through the media. That's why JCPA is bringing you this webinar, to assist the Community Relations Network and provide an opportunity to learn more about the current situation, to find out what is myth, what is fact, and to help you have conversations at your local level. We're really grateful that the esteemed Honorable Erwin Kotler has agreed to speak with us today. He's the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada and a renowned human rights advocate. He has a long-standing involvement with the African asylum seeker issue since his days as Justice Minister in Canada, setting up the refugee determination process in Canada and proposing one for Israel. He's testified before the Knesset committees in this regard. He's met with civil society leaders and spent a month in Israel making presentations to government leaders, Knesset members, and civil society organizations. He most recently wrote an op-ed published in the Times of Israel entitled Israelis African Asylum Seekers: What Can Be Done? After Erwin's presentation, there will be a Q&A. You can write your questions in the chat box on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible as we can pool these questions together that are similar. So without any further ado, I present to you the Honorable Erwin Kotler.
Thank you, Dan, for those kind and somewhat exaggerated words of introduction. So with respect to that, which you said about the African asylum seekers, I accept that as statements of fact. The rest I'll take as the charitable introduction by a colleague and friend. This webcast is taking place at an important moment in the case and cause of African asylum seekers, where we have been witnessing some watershed developments in the last week alone, where some 20,000 Tel Avivians, and not only Tel Avivians, but those who had gathered in Tel Aviv, held a peaceful protest, the largest that has been held in that regard almost ever in Israel, where amongst them were not only African asylum seekers, but it included even residents from South Tel Aviv. And this is one of the first times that both groups came together to frame a message which said no to deportation, yes to South Tel Aviv. To look at this as being a kind of win-win opportunity rather than a zero-sum game. Where the Canadian government just days ago entered into an agreement with the Israeli government to ensure that those African asylum seekers who had made application to Canada for refugee status in Canada, so long as their applications are pending in Canada, would not be subject to deportation. And we're talking now about some 2,000 African asylum seekers in this particular issue. And I might note that Canada is now the largest settlement country for African asylum seekers from Israel. Where Justice Eliakim Rubinstein, the former deputy president of the Israeli Supreme Court, a distinguished and respected judge, and I would say person who in Israel is respected by all spectrums of Israeli society, having served at one point as a legal advisor to both defense and foreign ministry, having appreciated this particular issue and sat in judgments on it, critiqued the refugee determination process as being effectively inaccessible and one that is not providing a remedy, using the fact that, for example, less than 1% of the applicants in Israel get refugee status coming from Eritrea and Sudan, where if you look at the situation in Canada, 97% of the Eritreans who applied and most of the Darfurians who applied received protected status. So to understand how important these developments of the last week alone are, we need to appreciate how different the situation was as recently as 2 months ago, when I arrived in Israel as a kind of advocacy and fact-finding mission on behalf of African asylum seekers. And Dan has mentioned that I had discussions in Israel from the Prime Minister to ministers in the government to some 25 members of the Israeli Knesset, in particular leaders of civil society and the like. And I just want to add, and I think that was mentioned, that this is an issue with which I've had some involvement for close to 15 years, beginning in my time as a justice minister. Because what happened was that the same demographics of Darfurians and Eritreans who came to Israel beginning in 2005, 2006, also came to Canada at that time. Now, Israel at the beginning did the right thing. It gave them a temporary protected status. But as the numbers grew and as the situation began to appear to be more apprehensive, to the point where some 1,500 African prospective asylum seekers and the like were arriving in Israel per month in 2010 and 11, at which point I testified in the Knesset at the time, and where the discourse in Israel increasingly turned to the notion that these were mistananim, which is a rather pejorative term meaning illegal infiltrators, but has as its background context a law that referred and originated in reference to terrorists. And more than that, they were characterized as criminal predators. Some members even of the Israeli Knesset and government referred to them at times as a cancer, saying that we're going to make their life miserable so that they would have to leave. And all of this was because there was a backdrop of apprehension that they represented both a security and demographic threat. And one could understand somewhat the apprehension in the sense that the arrivals were at that point coming to close to 1,500, sometimes 2,000 a month. Israel did not know how to cope with that. Fears grew at the time. And then, as Dan mentioned, a fence was built. And with the building of the fence, that put an end to African asylum seekers being able to reach Israel. For example, not one entered Israel in 2017. Only one has entered since May 2016. So effectively, the security and demographic threat had been put to rest. But the apprehension was still embedded in the psyche of many Israelis. And so the pejorative and one might call prejudicial, prejudgmental language that referred to them as infiltrators before one made a determination as to whether they were either legitimate asylum seekers or migrants or otherwise, the apprehension was there and the policy followed that apprehension. And so I arrived 2 months ago in the wake of a series of decisions that effectively reflected that sense of apprehension, no longer well-founded, but as I tried to suggest, that which had evolved from this period over time of where they were described as mistananim, infiltrators, and the like. And so the Israeli government, and this happened almost when I arrived in December, made a decision to deport by an amendment to the infiltration law, with all the symbolism that implied, made a decision to deport the infiltrators, as they put it, to a third country. And the very nature of this being done under the infiltration law tended to both underpin and validate the incriminating discourse of close to the last decade. After the government made this decision, the Knesset supported it. And when I say the Knesset, I don't only mean the coalition parties in the government. I mean also the opposition Labour Party and the Yesh Atid Party. They also supported this decision. In fact, effectively only the members of Meretz and some of the Zionist Union of the Labour Party voted against it. The government also invoked a Supreme Court decision to effectively validate their decision, where the Supreme Court had basically spoken that Israel could remove African asylum seekers, migrants, whichever term you wish to use, could remove them to a third country, provided it was with the consent of the asylum seeker and provided that the third country would be a secure country in which their own stability and security would be guaranteed. And so what you had at that point was the government making a decision to remove, the Knesset approving that decision to remove, and the Supreme Court also appearing to give validation to that decision. So all the basic institutions of government seemed to approve a decision in like December to in fact remove the African asylum seekers to a third country, which country was known, though not publicized yet, as being Rwanda, and also including perhaps as another third country, Uganda. Now, with this validation by the main government bodies, this appeared to effectively marginalize any opposition, and so any opposition that did arise was sort of characterized as being fringe or being extreme or being for political reasons and the like. And the Israeli public, seeing that the government was supporting this, the Knesset was supporting this, the opposition in the Knesset was supporting this, the Supreme Court appeared to be validating this, then tended to also acquiesce in it and became effectively indifferent with respect to what was going on. At the same time, as many of you appreciate, in Israel, you have a kind of situation of crisis overload. And in particular, when I was there then in December, January, the threats emanating from Hezbollah in the north from Syria, from the Iranian connection, from Hamas in the south, from terrorist attacks that we don't always hear about here in North America. We happen to have an Israeli channel in our home, and I watch the Israeli TV news every night in Canada when I'm there and not in Israel. And I would find that the Israeli broadcast would often lead off with some sort of terrorist attack that might have been thwarted and the like, whereas in Canada, there was no even referencing to that attack. So you have in Israel a kind of crisis overload, which tends to preempt sometimes discussion of other issues, such as the issue of the African asylum seeker. And when I was there, and when we went to the Israeli Knesset to speak with Israeli Knesset members, there were so many emergency votes that were taking place on a whole spectrum of issues that our concern, or at least the concern of those who were with me, speaking about the African asylum seekers, became a secondary concern, not because it was a secondary concern, not because the Knesset members even wanted to treat it as a secondary concern, but because it became preempted by, as I say, the crisis overload and the spectrum also of votes on a whole variety of issues. And so you could naturally ask the question, as I began with a series of dramatic watershed developments in the last week, well, what accounted for the change? If the situation in Israel was so quiescent 2 months ago, if it appeared to be a situation of an Israeli public that effectively was indifferent or unengaged, what accounts for this difference? What brought about 20,000 gathering in Tel Aviv? What brought about a difference now where Knesset opposition members who had been opposed, who had been together with the government at the time and voted in support of this removal or deportation policy, now coming out against it, and so on. So let me just give some in one-liners, a number of the dynamics that I think account for this change, dynamics that I personally witnessed when I was there, which will lead into the discussion as well of what I might suggest can be done with regard to the JCPA's work in this regard as well. The first thing that I noticed in Israel that began to develop was broad-based grassroots advocacy. In other words, the changes in the policy began to evolve from the ground up rather than from the top down. And what occurred from the top down occurred somewhat reluctantly because of the critical mass from the ground up. Second, there was an effective coalition strategy that developed. When I first arrived, students were holding their own groupings. Their demos gathered at best sometimes 50 people. Gatherings that took place of rabbinical leaders, policymakers, immigrant and refugee were advocates and the like. Many of them were working somewhat in silos, but gradually there developed a convergence, and that convergence brought together more of an effective advocacy from below. The third thing is there was diaspora involvement and encounters. And Dan, you made reference to the representations that your organization made on behalf of the community. And I think those representations helped in terms of changing the public sensibility in Israel as well. There were legal challenges that were being initiated at the time, some of whose results occurred in the last weeks alone as well, where a court held that Eritrean deserters from the army do qualify as asylum seekers, and where another judgment when I was in Israel held that, in fact, the refugee determination process is effectively inaccessible to the applicants. And if you looked at the data, you would see that it is inaccessible. Of some 40,000 African asylum seekers, forgetting the 20,000 that have already left, only 15,000 were able to even tender their application to begin with. after tendering their application, it took a protracted period until they got an answer. And when they finally got an answer, only 10 received refugee status. 9 Eritreans, 1 Darfuria. And so, whereas, for example, 97% of the same demographic of Eritreans that applied to Canada got refugee status, less than 1% of that same demographic got it in Israel. And the same with the Darfurians, even less, which accounted for Justice Eliakim Rubinstein's statement of last week, and also for the judgment that I mentioned of an Israeli court to the effect that the refugee system is effectively inaccessible also to begin with. There were as well a series of effective op-eds that raised awareness. There was the singular advocacy of American Jewish philanthropist Joey Lowe, who's been making a series of visits to Israel, who has been someone who has been supporting the African asylum seeker students and providing them and subventing them with scholarships at Israeli universities, who took this case to heart in such a way. And, you know, he has a home in Israel, he has children living in Israel, but he felt this issue so keenly and was interviewed by the media very broadly. And when he spoke almost as if, you know, you are deporting people who I regard as my children. And as I said, we met with Knesset members and tried to convey to them, you know, when you voted almost automatically. There was no real reflection, no real examination, no real thinking about what was going on. And as I said, we met with about 25 Knesset members, and I'm pleased to say that, in fact, we've seen, not only from representations that I was making, but others like Joey Lowe and diaspora representatives, that there's been a change in Knesset thinking. We had an emergency forum in the Knesset itself, which was jammed, not only with Knesset members, admittedly not then from the government, but also civil society leaders who came. There were multiple forums of civil society groupings, effective, informed, expert policy critiques, and the like that I happened to participate in. There were the testimonies that emerged from asylum seekers themselves who had gone to Rwanda to say that not only was their status there insecure, and not only was it unsecured, but in fact, most of them had to leave Rwanda to another country equally insecure, so that the undertaking by Israel that they would deport only to a secure third country was in fact not taking place. And when the Supreme Court of Israel had made the decision to support their going to a third country, they were under the view that in fact those security guarantees given by the government were in fact secured, and regrettably the testimonies showed that they did not. And so the result of all this was that the Israeli public was beginning to move from being a bystander or disengaged community to being a community that was very engaged and very involved. In other words, a developing critical mass of engaged advocacy that found expression, as I said, in the 20,000 that gathered in Tel Aviv. So my conclusion with respect to the role that we can all play here, the first thing we have to do if we want to be effective in any representation that we make to Israeli decision makers, let alone to the Israeli public, is we have to know the facts, we have to learn the facts, and guard against misinformation. I say that because I see very often headlines that Israel is engaged in mass deportation of all African asylum seekers. That's not correct. Part of the policy that began to evolve in December, and that needs to be known, is that Israel has undertaken not to deport children, women, families, vulnerable people whose applications are pending. Now, admittedly, they said for now. And that is an important parenthetical addendum that we have to monitor. But it's important to appreciate that it is undertaken at this point that it will not deport those groups. Effectively, they said the only group that will be subject to deportation are male Eritreans between the ages of, let's say, the early 20s and 45. But the recent judgment by an Israeli court to the effect that Eritrean army deserters will now be regarded as legitimate refugee applicants also changes the equation in that regard as well. So the first thing is we have to know the facts, lest if we accuse Israel of deporting everybody or engage in the removal of everybody, we will not be effective in making the representation. As well, in making the presentation, we have to guard against using, for example, Holocaust analogies. When I was in Israel and those analogies would be made, this tended to cause not only people in the government or in the parliament to be upset by the analogy, but even amongst the public. I acknowledge that those analogies are made sometimes out of a great sense of frustration and even a great sense of pain and a great sense of concern by those who make them. And they are made even by Israelis themselves. And the Anne Frank analogy was used with regard to providing sheltered homes to protect against deportation. And I understand the good faith that's involved. And I understand the intention that underpins it when it is used. But I have to tell you, and I see it and saw it amongst Israelis, that when you use Holocaust imagery, you may lose them when you could make effective arguments without using that imagery. Similarly, when you make the accusation that Israel is a racist state, and I've heard even worse, again, you may lose the Israelis. This is not to say that there have not been acts of racism that have taken place in all this, or that there have not been people who have given expression to racist attitudes. But a collective indictment of Israel as a racist state will tend to lose, again, those amongst the decision makers and the government and Knesset, and those amongst the Israeli public who can become allies, in the sense that it's not so much that they become allies with people in the diaspora, but that we can work together in common cause because we have a shared commitment to having a fair, effective, and just refugee determination process, so that people will not be removed arbitrarily, preemptively, as a result of prejudicial discourse and the like. And let me, if I may, just close, because I know there was a question as to what one can do in terms of representations that we might make here. Very quickly, and some of this is in my article, so I don't want to belabor and burden you with some of these. Number one, I would agree with what Dan said. I think one of the major generic recommendations we can make to Israeli decision makers and to their representatives in the diaspora through the consulates here is to call upon them to suspend, if not repeal, the planned forced, what you might call deportation imprisonment protocol as set forth in the amendment to the infiltration law in December, which is now embodied also in the deportation notices that were sent out early this month to African asylum seekers and migrants, in which I might add, parenthetically, 25 distinguished Israeli legal experts have now characterized as a violation of international law and basic human rights. So I think this is certainly a cautionary note that we can make in our representation to the Israeli consulates, and call upon them to suspend, if not repeal, any prospective deportation, let alone imprisonment protocol set forth in the amendment to the infiltration law. Second, and this is crucial, to establish a just, fair, and effective refugee determination process, so that refugee claims can be made to begin with, so that people wanting to access the system can do so, which is very difficult now. so that their applications are processed in a timely and fair manner, and where a just determination can be made of their applications in accordance with international standards. Third, we should provide asylum seekers awaiting the processing of their asylum request with a temporary protected status that ensures a minimal safety, stability, and dignity, which includes the possibility to work legally and gainfully, and protection against any arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. Specifically, we should call for a protected status to some 6,000 non-Arab Darfurians that was recommended even in a legal opinion written by a refugee determination status unit some 3 years ago, but never acted upon. And we are dealing here people who fled a Darfurian genocide and mass atrocities that have occurred since. Fifth, to cease and desist from any discourse of incitement against African asylum seekers in Israel. Simply put, to put an end to the discourse of them being characterized as infiltrators, which, as I said, is a prejudicial and prejudgmental term, to end the incitement that scapegoats them as dangerous predators who are responsible for all that ails South Tel Aviv. And yes, we have to respect the anxieties and apprehensions of the residents of South Tel Aviv, but this can be a win-win situation. We should do what needs to be done with regard to South Tel Aviv and do what needs to be done with regard to the protected status for African asylum seekers, and to cease and desist from any political or electoral manipulation of the vulnerable of South Tel Aviv and the African constituency in their neighborhood. Finally, I think that it would be important for Israel to engage constructively with the United Nations Commission on Refugee Rights, which has had a standing offer to work with Israel to resettle asylum seekers, and which is prepared to facilitate the resettlement of upwards of some 10,000 of them. As I said, Canada will be taking some 2,000 of them. But if we can develop a process of some responsibility sharing, if I can use that term in this regard, where the US as well would take a certain number of African asylum seekers, and some going to some Scandinavian countries and the like, this will ease the situation and burden with respect to Israel, will bring about a process, as I said, of responsibility sharing, and will help to solve the problem for even those who, if not designated as having a protected refugee status after their applications are determined. Nonetheless, we have to realize that these asylum seekers, many of them have been living in Israel for 6, 7, sometimes 10 years. Their children who are living there, the only language they know is Hebrew. The identity that they have is an African Israeli identity. We should start looking at them as being a prospective asset, an asset in diplomatic terms, an asset as they are now in economic terms, because they are working in important service jobs in Israel and the like. So they are an asset in economic terms, in diplomatic terms, also in cultural terms, and we need to look at them in that regard. And I'm pleased also that the Attorney General of Israel issued recently as well some strict guidelines with respect to removal to a third country, to ensure that that third country to which they are removed is a third country where they will be guaranteed safety and security and protected refugee status, of the kind of agreement that Canada recently negotiated together with Israel. So, to conclude with one sentence, we need, and Israel needs to develop an immigration policy that is anchored in the values of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, protecting Israel's security while protecting the values of respecting the stranger, which, as we know, is referred to some 36 times in the Bible. And so we can, here in the diaspora, do our part in helping to work in concert with Israel, as partners with them, in developing Israel as a Jewish and democratic state with regard to this particular issue of African asylum seekers. Thank you.
Erwin, thank you so much for that detailed and comprehensive overview of the situation and for your very important recommendations of what we can do. I'm Melanie Roth-Gorelik, Senior Vice President of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and I'm going to help moderate the questions for Erwin. So if anyone wants to ask questions, there's the chat box in front of you, and you can just post your question, and then we're going through them all, and we are going to ask some of them and pull some of them together. Erwin, one of the first questions that we have is, could you go into a little bit more detail on what are some of the demographic concerns within Israel itself, and how would you respond? How would you respond for those who are concerned by allowing the asylum seekers and migrants to stay of this population would remove the Jewish from the Jewish state?
Okay, I understood, as I mentioned, the demographic concerns when they arose some 7 and 8 years ago, when you had a situation that some 1,500 upwards at times of 2,000 African seekers were arriving per month, and Israelis could not see any end to this, and the apprehension grew that this was both a demographic threat and a security threat. And that argument, one could understand. I heard it from Israelis themselves. I remember appearing before Knesset committee, hearing it from Knesset members. It was a legitimate concern because it appeared to be an open-ended stream that were coming in of 2,000 a month, and that's when, as I say, the apprehension developed. But with the building of the fence or wall, that apprehension really should be put to rest. We now have a finite number. We know that that number does not exceed 38,000. We know that there are no more coming in. We also know that not those in the 38,000, and I've spoken with many African asylum seekers, yes, they want to get a protected refugee status in Israel, but they see themselves as returning eventually to their countries of origin when their own countries of origin become peaceful and secure and able for them to return. And those that will stay in Israel will certainly not affect the demographics of a Jewish state. You can't have a situation where if at the most, let's say 25, 30,000 will remain, that's going to have any demographic threat or affect at all the population of a country of 8.5 million, where they represent some 0.05%. So I don't see at this point any fear or apprehension, though I acknowledge I understood it when it arose under different circumstances, and I acknowledge that some people may still harbor it for the reasons that I mentioned.
Okay. Thank you, Erwin. I know that you mentioned some comprehensive policy that had been considered, but is there any current legislation or comprehensive policy being considered on this in the Knesset? And at the same time, what is the role that we in America can do? I know you listed a lot of wonderful points at the end of your presentation, which we will share when we resend out this, but if people could go away with 3 points of what we can do here in the United States to share our concerns and also to help the refugees, the asylum seekers and migrants specifically, how would you guide us?
The first thing I would say is to clarify the facts surrounding the African asylum seekers. There's a good deal of misinformation, and in fact, if we become parties to that misinformation, however inadvertently, the result is that we don't help the situation, but we in fact confuse the situation. So the first thing I would say, what is needed is a kind of moral clarity about what is happening, and then the presentation of the issues to the North American public in a manner that not only reflects that moral clarity, but does not in any way abuse it by using certain analogies, as I said, which are inappropriate and unhelpful, such as Holocaust analogies. And then we have to come up with specific requests in that regard. The most important of which, as I said, are twofold. One, that Israel should temporarily suspend, if not repeal, the prospective deportation process. And two, put in place a fair, just, effective, comprehensive refugee determination process, providing the necessary resources for that purpose so that the decision-making can be fairly and efficiently expedited, and so a proper resolution to this issue can be achieved.
In the same light, how can one successfully counter here in the United States articles coming out of the Jewish press about the increase of crime in South Tel Aviv and the fear that Israelis have who live in that area and have to leave their apartments alone?
Look, I have visited South Tel Aviv many times over the years. I understand the fear and the apprehension of the residents of South Tel Aviv. I understand also how that fear and apprehension developed over time. It was not there initially. It developed, number one, because there was false and misleading information that was being used and fed to them by people who should have known better. When I say false and misleading information, where they were being accused of being responsible for most of the criminality in South Tel Aviv, when the statistics would show that in fact the percentage of crime committed by them was less than the percentage of crime by those who were non-African asylum seekers. But leaving that aside, it was the discourse, the ongoing drumbeat of incitement, which referred to them not only as infiltrators, at least that was the prejudicial name of the law under which they were being prospectively deported. But I'm referring to the incitement over the years, which referred to them as predators, as criminals, and worse. And that was a kind of discourse that came down from decision makers, internalized by the South residents of Tel Aviv, who then began to view them through the same looking glass that they were told to see them by people, as I said, who should have known better, who were also peddling data that in fact was incorrect about their criminality. As well, it should be recalled that regrettably, the issue with regard to South Tel Aviv was mishandled from the outset. When the African asylum seekers who arrived in Israel were sent en masse to South Tel Aviv, rather than have a fair and equitable dispersal throughout the country. And where, when they were sent to South Tel Aviv, they were sent there with having to, in effect, fend for themselves, where no proper rights were given to them as well as prospective asylum seekers. And where the residents of South Tel Aviv, who independently should have had their own situation better respected and better taken care of, and which until this moment still requires that kind of care and compassion by decision makers. That is why I think there was this realization lately by residents of South Tel Aviv, you know what? Maybe we should be joining together in common cause with African asylum seekers. And so the demonstration in Tel Aviv of 20,000 people with a framing message saying no to deportation, yes to the residents of South Tel Aviv. And where residents of South Tel Aviv were also amongst the 20,000 demonstrators. So no longer was, as I said, a zero-sum game pitting one group against the other, but where we can do the right thing for both, and where in doing the right thing for both, we will better the human condition of both.
Thank you. I have a clarifying question, which is, can you explain the difference between an economic migrant and an asylum seeker, and how each of them are vetted in Israel?
Well, the point is that we don't know, and that's an important question, because we don't really know who is the economic migrant and who is the person deserving of refugee status until such time as a determination is made, a refugee determination process makes a fair and effective and informed determination according to law. They may find that some of them are in fact migrants, and they may find that some of them are in fact refugees. I've used the term African asylum seekers because it is a term which does not prejudge. If you use the term mistananim, which means illegal infiltrators, you are already not only prejudging them, but predetermining that they should be deported. If you use the term migrants, it's not as bad almost as saying illegal infiltrators, but here too you're removing them preemptively from being adjudicated as to whether maybe they belong in a protected refugee status. If you use the term asylum seekers, you're saying they are seeking asylum. We don't know yet if they deserve asylum. We don't know yet that maybe they are in fact only migrants and not those deserving of refugee status. But it is amongst the terms perhaps the most neutral term of all. But the main thing is we need to have, as I said, a fair, objective, informed refugee determination process. We will then know who are the migrants and who are the refugees.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Erin, very much for answering all of our questions and providing us with a basis of information so that we can better understand this issue, as well as some things that we can actually do. JCPA is going to close. We're going to put up a slide. We encourage you to contact your consulate, so your consulate from the government of Israel, and to set up a meeting to share your concern. Again, you can listen to this webinar, and we will write out some of the suggestions that Erwin gave us of how to discuss this issue with them. We also, many of our JCRCs are supporting the hotline for refugees and migrants, and the information is here on your slide. And also the Bialak Rogozin School, which we have visited several times on our missions to Israel. And they're doing exceptional work educating the children of any refugee and migrant in the country of Israel, whether they're there legally or illegally. So please support these good programs and speak out. Erwin, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Noah. I just want to say one word. I think that the JCPA has a distinguishable role to play because you are really a consortium and representative consortium of communities. So your voice is important. Your voice will be listened to. It is a representative voice. It's an informed voice. And the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants, the Bialak Rogozin School, both of which I visited, are deserving of support. So I want to thank you for doing this. And I'm saying, Kol hakavod to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.